The trilogy fight is a time-honored tradition in mixed martial arts, most often happening at the highest levels. It represents two rivals peaking at the same time, demanding we see a series of 3 bouts to determine who truly is the better fighter. But not all rivalries reach such hallowed ground. Sometimes 2 is enough, and today we'll be looking at 10 bouts that all but guaranteed a third fight would never happen because the rematch left absolutely no doubts about who was the best. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are 10 rematches that definitively ended rivalries. Number 10. Daniel Cormier vs. Rumble Johnson 2. When you have the type of power that can put anyone in the entire sport away with a single punch, there's going to be intrigue whenever you fight, and there is no better example of this than Rumble Johnson. In both of his fights with Daniel Cormier, Johnson would close as the betting favorite. It was understandable heading into their first bout at UFC 187. Johnson had just recently destroyed Alexander Gustafsson and was meant to fight John Jones for the light heavyweight title on that pay-per-view. When JBJ was stripped due to his hit and run, Cormier, who had just lost to Jones earlier that year, was selected to fill in against Rumble for the vacant strap. Despite a huge shot in the first that looked like it would put down a rhino, DC survived and would embrace the grind, smothering Johnson for the better part of 3 rounds and exhausting him to the point of essentially giving up in the end and losing to a rear naked choke. You would think that such a performance would make Cormier the favorite in their rematch, especially since the champ now had 2 more wins under his belt, but Johnson was KOing top light heavyweights left and right, and fans still believed in his power heading into UFC 210. Rumble would bafflingly use a grappling heavy strategy in the rematch despite early success in striking, and would ultimately succumb again to a rear naked choke after being exhausted and battered by DC. Following the fight seemingly abandoned by his coaches, Johnson retired, at least for the time. Although always a serious threat on the feet, DC twice proved he could wear down and break Rumble, leaving fans confident in there never needing to be a third bout. Number 9. Anderson Silva vs. Chael Sonnen 2. It took the Spider Anderson Silva less than 3 minutes to take the middleweight title from fan favorite Rich Franklin with devastating knees from the clinch. The two would meet again at UFC 77, and it was evident the Spider was simply better in all aspects. Their friendly rivalry ended with more brutal knees. A less friendly rivalry began 6 fights later with Chael Sonnen. The American gangster ran a scorched earth media campaign against the champion leading up to their first bout at UFC 117 and largely delivered, dominating the fight but for the last 2 minutes, where he would be caught in a triangle armbar and submitted. The only criticism of his performance being the inability to put the Spider away or do substantial damage. That and the elevated testosterone fail afterwards. The two would meet again at UFC 148, and round 1 was all Sonnen again dominating from top position. But like the first fight, the damage to Silva was minimal, and when Chael was unable to score a takedown in the second, a mistimed spinning back fist put him on the canvas where he would be finished with a knee to the body. Sonnen makes for a unique entry on our list in that he won the majority of the time in both fights, but fans simply couldn't get on board with a third try given how the second round of the rematch went down and Silva's seemingly supernatural ability to always come out on top against the bad guy. Number 8. Brock Lesnar vs. Frank Mir 2. If, hypothetically, Frank Mir were to have a horseshoe up his ass, as Brock Lesnar famously claimed following UFC 100, it could very much explain the result of his first bout with the Beast Incarnate at UFC 81. Despite having only a single professional bout, Lesnar was beating the hell out of the former champion Mir when he caught that knee bar 90 seconds in and scored the victory. Brock would of course go on to be champion shortly thereafter, Frank the interim, and so Lesnar would get his chance at avenging his only loss at UFC 100. Brock's recklessness cost him in their first fight, but a year and a half had passed, and it was clear that Lesnar had gained confidence, poise, and was not going to put himself in a position to get caught in a submission again. The result was a 2-round beating that was far worse for Mir than the last 90 seconds they spent together. Controlling Mir from top position for much of the fight, Lesnar took those tool chests he calls hands and absolutely battered Mir until the fight was called a minute and 48 into the second, leaving the challenger looking like Charlie in Hereditary after a nice piece of cake. It was arguably the peak of Lesnar's career, and given the freak nature of the ending of their first fight along with the far more calculated beating of the second, there was no doubt this rivalry was over, even if Mir always wanted a third. Number 7. BJ Penn vs. Jens Pulver 2. When lightweight champion Jens Pulver met BJ Penn for the first time at UFC 35, he was a big betting underdog. Penn was that new hotness, 3-0 as a pro with 3 KO TKOs in the UFC, and the first American to ever win gold as a black belt at the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship. The guy was a prodigy, and the hype around him was through the roof. The first 2 rounds had everyone thinking Penn was exactly who they thought he was. He was burning right through Pulver, nearly getting the stop twice. Lil Evil saved by the horn in the second. But then BJ began to fade, and Pulver rallied back in the third and fourth, 4th, the two would go toe-to-toe in the 5th, and this all-time classic would end in a majority decision for the underdog champion. Penn wouldn't lose again in the UFC until his welterweight title eliminator with George St. Pierre. After losing his rematch with Matt Hughes for the 170-pound strap, Penn decided to move back down to lightweight, and to greet him would be his old rival Pulver, who was in a completely different place now. Jens was stripped of his title shortly after defeating BJ due to a contract dispute and would leave for the regional scene and Japan, returning 4 years later getting KO'd by a soon-to-be contestant on the Season of Tough he would be coaching against Penn, Joe Lozon. Pulver and Penn would fight on the finale, and it was not the same bout. BJ would remain in dominant position on the ground for the better part of the 2 rounds and end the fight with a rear naked choke. His lightweight title reign would begin immediately thereafter, while Pulver would lose 6 of his next 7. Number 6. John Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson 2. It's one of the greatest title fights in UFC history, and one that many thought John Jones could have lost on the cards to light heavyweight challenger Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 165. I don't agree with that assessment, but there is no doubt arguments, and wow, at the time, fans were just amazed that JBJ was in so much trouble. We'd never seen him struggle at all with anything inside the cage at that point, but for a freak armbar attempt by Vitor Belfort. This was completely different though. Gus was mounting serious offense. He was hurting the champion, even took him down once. When the dust settled though, JBJ won via unanimous decision. But the narrative afterwards was that we needed a rematch because it was the best challenge Jones had ever faced.
Are you challenging me?
The two were set to do so at UFC 178 in 2014, but Gus was forced out with a torn meniscus, and we wouldn't see them run it back for another 4 years. By that time, things had changed considerably. Jones had been stripped, suspended, and brought back a number of times. Alex had given Daniel Cormier a run for his money in a title fight, but came up short. When DC vacated the light heavyweight title prior to Jones's return in 2018, Gus was the logical choice to face JBJ for the vacant title at UFC 232, given his most recent victories. This fight was not the classic everyone hoped for though. Jones controlled the fight largely from distance, taking very little damage, and over the course of the first 2 rounds put it on Gus. In the 3rd, he would score an easy takedown and maul the mauler for an impressive and decisive TKO win. Maybe if the rematch happened in 2014, there would be a reason for a 3rd fight, but following their 2018 showdown, this rivalry had been completed. Number 5. Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal 2. One of the best years in mixed martial arts history was rewarded with a much-deserved and highly anticipated welterweight title shot for the ultra-popular Jorge Masvidal in 2020. But instead of a proper build to a bout with Kamaru Usman, Masvidal seized the opportunity to save a huge card by stepping in for Gilbert Burns on 9 days' notice at UFC 251. The resulting outcome was Usman all but completely controlling the fight, scoring 50-45 on 2 judges' scorecards. The champion's superior grappling and ability to dictate where the fight was fought were just too much. Almost immediately though, Masvidal's camp shifted the narrative towards the short notice weight cut and lack of proper camp. After Usman defeated his original opponent Gilbert Burns, Gamebred swung that story into an immediate rematch at UFC 261. However, this time things would go much worse despite having time to prepare. The champ controlled the fight with his striking instead of his grappling, a huge surprise considering Masvidal was believed to be the far superior striker. And in the 2nd round, Usman KO'd the challenger in dramatic fashion, the only such loss of Gamebred's career but for a single bout in 2008. After dominating the first encounter and putting Jorge away on the feet in the 2nd, it's going to take a considerable effort for Masvidal to convince the UFC or the fans that there should ever be a 3rd fight with Usman. This rivalry is almost certainly finished. As Street Jesus even pointed out post-fight, quote, "He's got my number." Number 4. Demetrius Johnson versus John Dodson 2. It was billed as the fastest title fight in UFC history. Flyweight champion Demetrius Johnson versus John Dodson at UFC on Fox 6. And it was an interesting matchup. The challenger's power was unusual for the division, and as the billing stated, both men were really fast. The bout would mark the first defense of DJ's title reign and largely delivered. Dodson had some serious success early, scoring officially 1 knockdown in the 2nd round, but he hit the champ with some big shots. The rest of the fight after that, though, was all Mighty Mouse. A relentless pace that tired out the challenger, 5 takedowns, nearly 3 times the landed strikes, and absolutely brutal knees to the head and body in the 4th and 5th round. Johnson would win via unanimous decision and leave Dodson bloodied and battered. The 2nd fight would come 7 defenses into Johnson's tenure. At this point, fans were just looking for anything that could be considered a challenge to the champ, and those early knockdowns from their first fight held weight. The rematch at UFC 191 would be just like the first, but with none of the impressive early offense from Dodson. Johnson again pushed the pace, this time avoiding nearly completely any significant shot from the Magician and wearing him down into the championship rounds. It was a clinical performance with absolutely no doubt who would be the winner when the scorecards were read. John Dodson simply had nothing for him, and with 2 fights now with similar outcomes, the 2nd more definitive than the first, there was no way we were ever going to see a trilogy bout. The sport's fastest rivalry was finished. Number 3. Rampage Jackson versus Chuck Liddell 2. In August of 2003, Dana White sent his only son, UFC star Chuck Liddell, to Japan to compete in the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. The Iceman kicked off his tour by KOing Alistair Overeem in the quarterfinals, but in the semis, Chuck would run into Rampage Jackson, and despite a solid effort in the early parts of the first round, as time went on, Liddell was taking the bigger shots, getting taken down, and looked visibly tired. A few minutes into the second, while being absolutely destroyed on the ground, Chuck's corner threw in the towel. Page would lose to Vanderlei Silva in the finals, while Liddell would head back to the States and go on his legendary run as the UFC light heavyweight champion. Now on a 7-fight win streak, champion Liddell would get the chance to avenge his loss to Rampage, who left Pride in 2006 and made his UFC debut by KOing Marvin Eastman. Despite Jackson struggling at the top tier in Pride, losing again to Silva and then Shogun Rua before leaving Japan, he looked like he was on a completely different level in the rematch with the Iceman. In less than 2 minutes, with really the first clean shot he landed, Rampage dropped the champion and left absolutely no doubt who was the superior fighter now. This was prime Chuck, champion Chuck, and he was destroyed in seconds. The loss would begin the steep decline of Liddell's career, putting a definitive end to this interpromotional rivalry. Number 2, George St. Pierre versus Matt Serra 2. It was the Cinderella story of all Cinderella stories. Matt Serra, at 4-4 in the UFC, won an Ultimate Fighter tournament, with the top prize being a chance at welterweight champion George St. Pierre, who he shockingly TKO'd in the very first round. It was the upset of the century. GSP was utterly embarrassed from nearly the opening horn until his head was bouncing off the canvas. Serra would go on to coach Tough and have a scheduled title defense against Matt Hughes, but an injury would leave him sidelined. In the meantime, GSP would secure an interim title by defeating Hughes, guaranteeing his chance at redeeming himself and reclaiming his title. Still completely embarrassed by the loss, St. Pierre planned to so fully dominate Serra that there would be no question the first fight was once in a lifetime, and he did just that. From the opening seconds to the end of the fight, GSP was all over the champ, takedown after takedown, constant passing, and smothering offense from top position. Serra completely exhausted by the end of the second, 8 massive knees to the body, forcing a stoppage. GSP had crossed a threshold in his career, and the turning point was this win. He was no longer going to underestimate his opponents or take unnecessary risks. Serra had nothing for him in their rematch, and while it was apparent this rivalry was over right then, as time went on, their paths diverged even more, leaving no doubt. Number 1, TJ Dillashaw versus Renan Barão 2. Still the biggest betting underdog at closing to ever win in the promotion, TJ Dillashaw's victory over bantamweight champion Renan Barão at UFC 173 was considered the upset of the year in 2014, but by the time their rematch was over, that narrative would change completely. Dillashaw was not next in line for a title fight when they first met. That was Rafael Assunção, but a lingering injury forced him out of the scheduled bout 2 months prior, and so without many options left, Dillashaw, who was 9-2 but had notable losses to John Dodson and Assunção, was selected as a replacement. In the lead up to the fight, Barão's insane nearly decade-long unbeaten streak was highlighted, as was his domination of TJ's teammate Uriah Faber. Believed to be a huge mismatch, Dillashaw stunned everyone and put on a master performance, completely dominating the fight for all 5 rounds before topping off what would be an easy decision win with a TKO finish halfway through the 5th. Despite the utter destruction, the two were immediately put in a rematch, which would take some time due to injuries, but when it finally did happen, the lines had changed. Dillashaw was now the favorite heading into their UFC on Fox 16 showdown, and again, TJ would dismantle Barão, dominating every aspect of the fight and battering the challenger until he was TKO'd in the opening seconds of the 4th round. Both fights were not even close, and Barão would never be the same after the series, losing 6 of his next 7. What started as a long shot ended with Dillashaw showing that the two weren't even in the same league. A big ol' shout out to my dude Luke Taylor for editing this video together. You can find him and his awesome digital art on Twitter at @cooltome_. A big thank you to Ben Rosette, who provided that sweet tune you heard in the intro. Check out his music by clicking the link in the description, and go give him a follow on his Instagram and Twitter page @Ben Rosette. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter, and have yourself a wonderful day.